This is going to be a shorter screencast about chromosomes and the cell cycle. So, sort of why does cell division happen and what does the general cycle of that look like? Before we really start talking about cell division, we need to understand some vocabulary. And it's kind of a little bit confusing vocabulary because there's a lot of words that sound similar. But let's start with this word chromosome. So think about what is a chromosome. And assuming that you are a human, how many chromosomes do you have in your cells? So each of your cells, except for the cells that maybe don't have chromosomes, like the red blood cells, but in most of your cells, how many chromosomes are there? So our definition of chromosome is one long folded and condensed string of DNA and proteins. So DNA is really, really long, it's like miles long. It would never fit in your cell if it was all just stretched out. So rather than being stretched out, it's kind of folded and condensed and coiled up in a way that allows it to fit in your cell. And it's coiled up with proteins. And so we refer to that one strand that's all coiled up and wrapped around proteins as a chromosome. How many chromosomes do you have? Well, you should have, assuming you don't have a chromosomal disorder and you are human, 46 chromosomes. So there's 23 different types of chromosomes. So there's like chromosome 1, chromosome 2, chromosome 3, chromosome 4, etc. And of each of those types, you have 2 of them. So you have 2 chromosome 1s, and you have 2 chromosome 2s, and you have 2 chromosome 3s, etc. One of those came from your mom, and one of each pair came from your dad. Now, other species do have different numbers of chromosomes. Some very simple species might have just like 9, but it's not necessarily correlated to the complexity of the species either, because hedgehogs have like 90-something chromosomes for some reason. So it does vary a lot from species to species, which is one of the reasons that organisms of different species usually can't reproduce together successfully. Okay, so now for that vocabulary, we've got chromosome. Now we've got chromatin. So chromatin is the substance that chromosomes are made of, which consists of, again, the DNA wrapped around proteins. The protein the DNA is wrapped around are called histones. They almost look like little spools. They're these red things. So the DNA is sort of twisted around these histones going through the strand, and then that whole thing is kind of bundled up. So this not only, allows the DNA to fit in your cells, but it also prevents it from tangling. Because imagine you have this really, really long strand. I mean, you've seen what happens maybe if you put headphones with cords in a bag, right? They come out like this horrible, impossible knot. So we don't want our DNA knotting up and tangling. And so this system of wrapping it around these proteins keeps it sort of nice and organized and not tangled up. So when you think of a chromosome, I imagine you probably picture this sort of X-shaped thing, because usually when you see pictures of chromosomes, like this is a microscope picture of chromosomes, electron microscope, usually when you see them in this X shape. And the truth is, they actually spend most of their time not hanging out in this X shape. They spend most of their time in a line. They only form this X shape when they're just about ready to divide, when the cell's just about ready to divide. But the reason you usually see them like this is because when they go into this X shape, they get much more condensed and kind of scrunched up, so they are easier to see visually. So that's why most of the pictures, they look like this X. But actually, usually, they just look like a line rather than an X. So vocabulary again, if we're looking at one chromosome, one unduplicated chromosome, it's just like a line like this. We also call the X, when it's a duplicated chromosome, one chromosome. So this is a chromosome, this is also a chromosome. A duplicated chromosome, each half is identical to the other half, so this half is an identical copy of this half, because when the cell divides, each new cell is going to get one of these halves. So we call these two halves, when they're bound together, sister chromatids. And the place that they're bound together, the thing that like sticks the two halves together, is called a centromere. Because it's kind of like a mirror, I guess. Each half is reflected of the other half. So chromosome, chromosome, chromatid, chromatid, centromere. Now it gets even more a little bit complicated, because remember how I said you have two of each chromosome? So like you have two chromosome number 1s and two chromosome number 2s. So we call those two chromosome number 1s, this looks like a smiley face, homologous chromosomes. And then the two chromosome number 2s are another pair of homologous chromosomes. So chromosome, chromosome, two sister chromatids, pair of homologous chromosomes. And we could also have a pair of homologous duplicated chromosomes. This looks like a dead face. So there's a lot of things that kind of start with chromo, so make sure you get those sorted out in your mind as what thing is what. Okay, so cell division. Let's address why. What's the point? What are some reasons that one cell would want to or need to divide into multiple cells? So there's a few reasons. For a single-celled organism, like a bacteria, like an amoeba, it's reproductive. These cells reproduce by dividing. They just divide in half, and now there's two of them. Growth. So you started out as a single cell that divided and divided and divided and divided over and over and over again as you grew into, an embryo, a fetus, a baby, and continued dividing as you grew older and got taller, larger, etc. So growing organisms need to make new cells as they grow. Tissue renewal. So, for example, if you look at your skin, the outer layer of your skin is dead. That's just dead cells. And you're constantly shedding off those dead cells, and then new cells are growing up from underneath to replace them. Similarly, the cells that are lining your digestive system, like the cells that are lining your stomach and your intestines, those are constantly needing to be replaced as well because of the sort of harsh conditions they're in. They're sort of getting digested a little bit, so you always need to be making new ones to replace those ones that are getting sloughed off or damaged, digested in your stomach. Similarly, there's cells that are like growing your hair, and those are constantly needing to make new cells and be replaced. So tissue renewal is one reason for cell division. And then we also have tissue repair. So if you get injured, if you break a bone, if you cut your skin, whatever it is, you need to make new cells to divide and fill in and replace those damaged or lost cells. So now the cell cycle, we see it drawn in a circle, kind of representing time going by. So we could divide this into two basic parts. The M phase is mitosis, which is the actual dividing part. And all of the rest of it, so all of this, can be referred to as interphase, which is the part where it's not actually dividing. This is the part where it's growing, where it's preparing to divide, etc. So if you notice like the relative length of these arrows, a lot more of the cell's time is spent in interphase than is spent in mitosis or M phase, the actual dividing. So most of the time, any given cell is not actually in the process of dividing. If we break down the parts of interphase, the first part is called G1 phase, which was known as the first gap, because when scientists first were researching this, they kind of thought that the cell was just not doing anything at this time. That's not really true, but still called it that. Most of this time is spent in cell growth, because remember, this comes right after division, so the cell is divided and it's like half the size it's supposed to be, so it needs to grow bigger, make all those organelles, etc., grow up to be a full-size cell. S phase stands for synthesis. This is the duplication of the chromosomes, so where the chromosomes go from line to X. So remember DNA replication? This is when DNA replication happens. And then we get G2 phase, the second gap, a little bit more growth and just kind of putting everything together and preparing for the actual dividing. Now, there's also this phase you might see here called the G0 phase. It says resting on this, but you should think of this more as non-dividing. So in G0 phase, the cell is not like dormant. It's still doing all of its cell stuff, whatever its job as a cell is. It's just not actively dividing at that time. So we call this a non-dividing state. This would happen after G1 phase. So the cell divides, it goes into G1, and then it kind of has a fork in the road here. Is it going to continue on to replicate its DNA and end up dividing again? Or is it going to not divide again? Is it done dividing? So for a full-grown adult, most of your cells will be in G0 phase. So this should make sense if you think about it. A lot of your cells, like if you're not growing taller, you don't need more bone cells. If you're not, injured, you don't need to make more cells to replace an injury. So while there are some cells that, continue to divide all the time, like those cells in your skin or your digestive system that we talked about, a lot of cells, like your nerve cells, your muscle cells, as long as you're not injured, never really divide. And actually, nerve cells, once you're mature, really can't divide anymore. You're kind of stuck with the number of nerve cells you have, which is why nerve damage and brain damage, etc., are so difficult to heal and sometimes impossible to heal. You have other cells like liver cells and bone cells which can divide again, but they will only do that if they need to like repair an injury. So normally if you're not growing any taller, your bone cells aren't dividing, but if you, break your bone, then those bone cells are quick to start dividing again to heal that. Similarly, if you, damage your liver by, ingesting some poison like alcohol, for example, your liver cells can divide to repair that damage. So certain cells have an easier time kind of exiting out of G0 and getting back into the cell cycle than others. Again, nerve cells in particular really don't ever go back into the dividing phase. So try not to damage your nerve cells too much. And then there's just a couple review questions here for you to think about and review this material.